with a split screen on the investigations into former President Trump. One in Florida, where the judge overseeing the Mar-a-Lago search says parts of the affidavit will be released by tomorrow. The other in Georgia, where Governor Kemp trying not to speak. The latest on both coming up. Plus, trigger laws blocking women from having an abortion go into effect today. Tennessee, Texas. What these new rules say about possible jail time for doctors. And then Russia cutting off a key Ukrainian nuclear plant from the country's power grid as the Russian president plans to grow his armed forces. We are live in the capital city with more on a new call between President Biden and President Volodymyr Zelensky. Plus, with school shootings becoming more common, we look at how principals across this country are working together to provide a playbook for communities who go through tragedies. That's in the original. And Novak Djokovic out of the U.S. Open because he still won't get vaccinated. What that means for the season's last tennis major later on in the show. Hey, everybody, I'm Yasmin, in for Hallie. A little before we came on the air, we learned that by noon tomorrow, we're going to see some part of that Justice Department's legal reasoning for why they ordered the FBI to search former President Trump's Florida home at Mar-a-Lago. Judge Bruce Reiner saying the government has met its burden to seal portions of the affidavit because they could jeopardize its ongoing investigation. But he's also siding with a motion by news organizations like us here at NBC News that some parts of this document showing the underlying probable cause for the search should, in fact, be released. The judge saying the DOJ's redactions are narrow enough to make that okay. As a reminder, the DOJ has argued they don't want to release anything because they just started the investigation, and any unsealed info may actually cause, quote, as they put it, significant and irreparable damage. The FBI seized 11 sets of classified documents from Mar-a-Lago, including some labeled top secret. Mr. Trump maintains he did nothing wrong. Want to go now to Ken Delaney, who's standing by for us. So this is obviously kind of major development. What are we likely to actually see by tomorrow?
Well, that's the big question, Yasmin, and we really don't know the answer. So it could be somewhat revealing, or it could be an incredible disappointment. All we know is that the judge has essentially agreed with the Justice Department that a lot of this affidavit of probable cause will have to be redacted, and that includes anything that offers a roadmap to the investigation or reveals investigative techniques or identities of witnesses, not just names, but identities, so descriptions of witnesses, identities of federal agents, and importantly, grand jury information. None of that can be revealed. Now, I've been talking today about what possibly could be revealed, and this is just a theory on my part, but one thing that I think would not necessarily compromise the investigation is the procedural history between the archives and the Trump organization and the Justice Department and Trump and his lawyers on all the government's efforts to get these documents back, going back to 2021, all the steps they took before they took the dramatic step of getting a search warrant. The problem with that, though, is that there's some of that is protected because it's grand jury information. Like we've reported that the Justice Department served a grand jury subpoena to try to get these documents, and then also subpoenaed some of the surveillance footage at Mar-a-Lago, which led them to be concerned about what was happening to some of these documents. Well, they can't, by law, reveal that. If that's in the affidavit, it's going to be blacked out. But they might be able to reveal some of the negotiations with the archives to at least inform the public that this just didn't happen overnight. This has been an ongoing process, and while Donald Trump is saying he's cooperating, he's been cooperating, there's a whole record that seems to belie that. Yeah.
Any suspected time we could expect this, Ken?
That's the other weird thing. Like, the deadline is noon tomorrow, but as far as we can tell, it could drop at any time because it appears that the Justice Department and the judge are in agreement on these redactions. So there's really nothing holding them up from just posting the thing 5 minutes from now. And if so, I'll run back to the camera. Yeah,
I would appreciate that. Thank you. We're also hearing, obviously, because a lot of things are going on here with regards to Trump world, hearing about this separate judge, right, wanting the former president's legal team to refine his request for this special master, basically someone to review the documents seized by the FBI. Why is that happening?
The Trump side is asking for this special master because they also want the FBI to stop looking at the documents, and they're asking for an independent, appointed special master to sift out things like attorney-client privilege documents or other documents that are not relevant to the investigation. By the way, the FBI is already doing that with what they call a filter team, but Trump wants them to go one step further. The judge didn't like the way Trump's lawyers filed this motion and asked them to do a number of steps to give her more information about why she even has jurisdiction, because it was interesting that they went to this Trump-appointed judge rather than the federal magistrate who works for her, who is politically independent. But she may have been Trump-appointed, but she really is giving the Trump lawyers a hard time, Yasmin.
All right, Ken, stay close. If it drops, I'm expecting you to be on camera immediately. Don't disappoint.
I will do that for you. Absolutely.
All right. Thanks, Ken.
Steps away.
Want to turn now to another investigation into the former president in Atlanta, actually, where the state's Republican Governor Brian Kemp is fighting an attempt by the Fulton County DA to force him to testify to a grand jury. This is actually a look that you see right here inside the courtroom earlier on today. The governor's legal team laying out both privilege and political arguments. Fulton County saying this can't be delayed any further. The governor expected to face questions related to the former president's attempts to falsely interfere with the 2020 election in the state of Georgia. I want to bring in Blaine Alexander, who's outside the courthouse, been covering this all day. Blaine, good to talk to you. Obviously, no decision as of yet today, but the judge does not necessarily appear or didn't appear to really like the political arguments, did he?
No, in fact, he said he didn't want to hear it in the courtroom. He said that wasn't necessarily the proper forum to discuss that. Now, what he did hear were the other arguments on executive privilege, attorney-client privilege, things of that nature. But when it came to political implications or, the attorney saying that it could have an impact on the governor's race for re-election in November, the judge essentially said that that's not going to be an argument to hear in the courtroom. He did, however, say that he has a lot to consider going forward, saying that he would consider the potential impact on this re-election bid. But it is notable that attorneys for Kemp really have kind of made that their central argument. That was something that was in the crux of their argument that they made in legal filings and tried to lay that out today in the courtroom as well.
Why is it, Blaine, that we are hearing the governor does not want to provide testimony here, considering the fact that he, in fact, was someone who stood up to the former president when it came to interference in the 2020 election? He is not a target at all, from what we know, of this investigation.
And his attorneys confirmed that again today in the courtroom, that he is a witness. But, they're claiming a couple of things. Sovereign immunity, one, executive privilege, two. But they're essentially saying that, listen, even if you don't quash the subpoena, let it be done later. Let this testimony happen after the November election. They really are pointing to the timing on all of this, essentially saying that when given the fact that we're about 2.5 months away from what they call the most closely watched gubernatorial race in the country, that there's no way that the politics or really kind of everything that's happening here doesn't seep into the politics leading up to the election. Now, it is important to point out, though, that for the DA's part, they're essentially saying that the governor's team is the one who politicized this in the first place, saying had they appeared in mid-August, as was the plan, this could have been avoided. There wasn't any media attention on this. Remember, all of us in the media thought that he had already given a video testimony. It wasn't until the day before that supposed testimony that the governor's team filed a motion to quash. That motion became public, and that's where there was a lot of media attention on this. So essentially, the DA's team is saying, hey, if he just shown up, gone in quietly, testified, nobody would have known anything about this, and you guys invited this attention upon yourselves.
That's interesting. And you talk about, obviously, the political implications of all of this big race up against Stacey Abrams come November as well. How is that all playing out?
We've seen a little bit of that already. In fact, during the hearing today, an attorney for Kemp kind of pulled up a tweet from Stacey Abrams in which she essentially is pointing to this new kind of friction between the DA's office and the governor's office and saying, in her words, that it shows that Kemp does not want to, quote, testify against Trump, and kind of using that to link the governor to the former president. She even kind of tweeted a sort of link to a sort of campaign video to that to that very point. So it's something that Kemp's attorneys brought up today in the courtroom. Yasmin.
All right, Blaine Alexander for us. As always, Blaine, it's great to see you. More than 5 million people in the South are still under a flood watch. Forecast calling for more rain through the weekend. This after as much as a foot of rain caused dangerous flash floods in parts of Mississippi. At least 42 residents were evacuated from a nursing home in Brandon, Mississippi, as nearly 3 feet of water from a nearby creek poured into the facility. You can see here residents clinging to a rope, helped by firefighters and volunteers as they wade through dangerous floodwaters. The storms, they stretched from eastern Texas across Louisiana through Mississippi, the capital city of Jackson receiving, get this, 8.7 inches of rain in 3 days, making this the rainiest August on record, 11.57 inches, and still a week to go, by the way. NBC's Bill Cairns has been tracking all this for us and is joining us now. As always, my friend, good to see you. Talk to us, because some of these images, they are startling, they're astounding, certainly putting people in places they don't want to be. And it doesn't seem like it's letting up.
Today's been a bad day, too. Not as rough as yesterday, where we had the nursing home and the evacuations. We're not watching areas that are in the same spots getting hit. It's kind of been on the move, and that's been a little good, too. So the areas that we just showed you all the pictures from was located right here around Jackson, and just to the east of Jackson was the worst flooding yesterday. Hit and miss showers and storms, but nothing like yesterday. The heaviest rains all morning long, and it was pretty epic, was around Biloxi towards Mobile. And everywhere you see in the maroon here is where we still have flash flood warnings, including the Biloxi area, and right just south here of Mobile, and a couple spots here, just one north of Macomb, and right along the Mississippi-Alabama border. So it's a little improved from yesterday, but we still have a chance for additional flash flooding. And as we head through the weekend, things are slowly going to subside. It's going to get a little bit less. It'll be hit and miss more instead of just soaking rain. This is the rainfall forecast as we head through Sunday. Notice the highest would be in Florida, kind of typical. You still expect those afternoon thunderstorms, and right along the Gulf Coast, which is where we've had the flooding so far this morning. So yeah, it's been a rough week. The stuff in Dallas on Monday, and then what happened Wednesday in Mississippi, things are starting to slow down.
Well, and it seems as if, though, the flooding has been so incredibly widespread because part of the ground was already saturated.
Yeah, this was a much different scenario than Texas. Remember, all summer long, we've been talking about how hot Texas was and the incredible drought. So we just got our new drought update that shows you where the worst drought is in the country. And this comes out every Thursday. And you notice that the Dallas area is no longer in the extreme drought because of the epic 6 to 12 inches of rain that fell on Monday. And the areas that we've had the really bad flooding yesterday and then also this morning, there's no drought whatsoever from New Orleans to Mobile, Panama City to Jackson to Montgomery and Birmingham. This area has had hit and miss rain on and off all summer long. And yes, so the ground wasn't quite as dry there, and the rivers were a little bit higher in the creeks, and that did allow us to have some of the flooding. So when they did get this rainfall over the last 72 hours, that was in the 6 to 10 to 12 inch range, especially east of Jackson. It wasn't a surprise that we still have a lot of rivers that are waiting to crest in those areas.
I know you're going to be watching it for us. Bill Cairns, as always, thank you. All right, women in Tennessee and Texas, they woke up to the reality of a post-Roe world, with doctors now on high alert after trigger laws in those states went into effect today, banning nearly all abortions and criminalizing the procedure. In Tennessee and Texas, no exceptions for rape or incest, the only exception to save the life of the mother. And doctors could face felony charges. In Texas, that includes a sentence of up to life in prison and a minimum of $100,000 fine. Idaho's trigger law also went into effect today, with exceptions for rape, incest, and when the mother's life is in danger. And it, too, would have criminalized performing an abortion to protect a woman's health, until a federal judge blocked that part yesterday, saying it contradicted a federal law that requires government-funded hospitals to give stabilizing treatment, in this case an abortion, during medical emergencies. Joining me now is Chloe Atkins to talk more about this. It's astounding. You think about how this is all affecting the country, right? What laws are in place where, and people don't even know where abortion is legal, where it's not legal, and what exceptions are there, especially in some of these states. These trigger laws are in place. And now you're thinking about the position this is putting doctors in, right, that are going to have to make the decision as to whether or not they should provide abortion services if they feel as if it's medically necessary, and or possibly face jail time.
I mean, that's right. You said it. You laid it out very eloquently. Look, one of the first calls that I had after the overturning of Roe v. Wade was with a provider who is located in a state that's hostile to abortion services in the Southeast. And she said, look, Chloe, I'm scared to provide abortion services, even if it's in an emergency, even if I think it's the right call to make, because I'm afraid that it will be later proven unnecessary to save that person's life. So these vague laws put providers at a huge legal risks. And as a result, it leads to a delay in care for patients or ultimately being denied care, which can lead to a pregnancy-related death.
Let's talk about the access that women have right now, right? If you're looking at the Washington Post, today they had a stat out. 1 in 3 women have lost abortion access in this country. When you look at the lay of the land and these trigger laws that are now in place today, I believe another one, North Dakota or South Dakota
later this
tomorrow.
Week, North Dakota.
Yeah, tomorrow. What does access look like in this country right now?
Huge swaths of the South and Midwest are basically without access. And so what that leaves patients with, or women who are of reproductive age in this country, is with very few options. They can, first and foremost, attempt to travel out of state, travel hundreds of miles out of state to a place or a city that they're not familiar with. But keep in mind, that comes with a huge cost. The average American does not have a couple $100s in emergency funds. They just don't. And an abortion costs around $500 and goes up in cost as the pregnancy progresses. And we're not even talking about airfare, cost of gas, or staying overnight in a hotel. So that leaves people having to stay home and carrying an unwanted pregnancy to term, which can lead to unwanted health risks and can push people further into poverty. But one thing I do want to mention that has happened over the past couple of years is this turn or this transition to people self-managing their own abortions using medication by either ordering it online or getting it through a trusted community member. And I spoke to one woman who obtained medication abortion through a friend who had traveled to Mexico to get medication abortion, and she terminated her pregnancy in her home in Texas safely and successfully while SB 8, their 6-week ban, was in effect. And SB 8 really gave us a window into what a post-Roe v. Wade world looks like.
So also, when you look at what took place in Idaho, right, it was kind of this narrow win, the first of for the Biden administration. Essentially, the judge there saying, OK, for now, it seems as if these emergency services can be provided. If basically in an emergency, right, an abortion can be provided because of the health of the mother. I'm wondering if this type of tactic can be applied elsewhere or will be applied elsewhere by the Biden administration to save reproductive rights for women across the country.
I think we very much so could be. I mean, I think to start off with, first and foremost, these court battles are not going anywhere. They're going to be playing out for years to come. It's kind of crazy how long court battles take sometimes. Yeah. And so we definitely could see this federal law that, to a degree, gives a protection to providers that are in hospitals that get federal funding. We could see that in many different cases surrounding the country. But I do think one thing to keep in mind is that when we see abortion being legal one day and then illegal the next day, that leads to mass confusion. For patients, for providers, which can ultimately lead to patients delaying care or not getting care at all.
Chloe Atkins, as always, thank you.
Thank you.
Good to see you.
Good to see you.
All right, I want to get to Ukraine now, where President Biden reaffirmed U.S. support in a call today with President Zelensky. The president also congratulating on their Independence Day, but calling it a, quote, bittersweet anniversary with the war now in its seventh month, I should say. Zelensky also said this was a great conversation a day after the Pentagon announced almost $3 billion in new aid, and that aid's coming at a critical time. Today, President Putin signing a decree to increase the Russian army big time starting January 1st. He plans to add, I should say, 137,000 combat personnel. And then on the ground, the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant briefly got disconnected from the country's power grid. That's the first time that's ever happened. And it led to power outages in a number of cities across southern Ukraine. Josh Letterman is joining me now with more on this. President Biden, Josh, and Zelensky, they spoke today about aid, about the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant as well, going offline for the first time. Talk about first the significance of this call.
Well, we saw President Zelensky yesterday as he was meeting with British Prime Minister Boris Johnson, saying that no country has done anywhere near what the United States has done to support Ukraine during this war. So I think that speaks to the importance and the centrality for the Ukrainians of their relationship with Washington right now and of keeping a constant line of communication with the White House. But they also, on that call today, spoke about the situation at Zaporizhzhia that you were just discussing, as President Zelensky says that today, for the very first time in history, the plant was disconnected from the power grid. And the reason is because there are typically 4 transmission lines that connect Zaporizhzhia to Ukraine's electricity grid. 3 of them were already knocked out earlier in the war. Today, there was a fire at a coal ash pit that appears to have damaged the last remaining one. And so for a time, it was disconnected. They had to rely on backup diesel generators to power the cooling system that keeps the nuclear reactors there from melting down. They also have a backup connection to a fossil fuel nuclear plant in the area. But in the meantime, out of the 6 nuclear reactors there, 2 of them were still operating. Wow. Both of them have now been taken off the grid, which speaks to just the height of concern right now as this nuclear crisis just continues to grow.
So amidst all of this, also we heard about this jump in armed forces presence by the Russian army. President Putin declaring that, I believe, a 14% jump or so in service members alone. Yeah. How do we read this?
Well, we should point out Putin is not saying explicitly that this has anything to do with the war in Ukraine, but it seems fairly apparent, given that this is the major military operation that Russia's military is engaged right now, that there is a need to really replenish the ranks, given what both NATO and U.S. officials have said is a significant troop losses by Russia in 6 months of war. And a big focus for President Putin has been on making sure that they are relying not on conscripts, drafted troops, but instead on volunteer troops serving in Ukraine, because they don't want to really diminish Russian domestic political support for this war by essentially forcing people against their will to come fight in Ukraine. And so part of this seems to be an effort by Putin to make sure he has as many troops as he needs to be able to continue to fight this war.
And then, of course, the train attack. We got to talk about that as well. The attacks against railways, they have played this outsized role in this war for Ukrainians really having to flee, right, their homeland, and also bringing into the country humanitarian aid. What more do we know about the circumstances surrounding this attack, Josh?
Yeah, the trains are so important because they're both civilian infrastructure, but also being used frequently for military purposes to transfer troops and weapons. So we know the death toll has risen to at least 25, including 2 children. But today, Russia's defense ministry said that in that attack, which they took credit for, that they killed 200 Ukrainian troops who were in the process of being transferred to the front lines. Now, we have not been able to independently confirm that, and Ukraine has not commented on that, but certainly that would be a significant loss for Ukraine if that were to be true.
Josh Letterman for us, as always. Thank you. Coming up, everybody, it is a major shift in the push for climate-friendly cars. The state that's going to ban the sale of gas-powered vehicles, I should say, and what it means for drivers. Plus, if you've had to renew your passport in the last couple of years, you know it's been a mess. The new system that is aiming to make the process way easier for travelers. We'll be right back. All right, just in, a historic environmental decision in the state of California today. Air quality officials voting a short time ago to require all new cars sold in the state to be zero-emission vehicles by 2035, just about 13 years from now. It's a really significant move. California is the largest auto market in the U.S. Gas vehicle emissions are the biggest source of carbon dioxide in California and make up about 40% of the state's greenhouse gas emissions. Reducing those emissions will also reduce the risk of severe drought, wildfires that wreak havoc on the state. Governor Gavin Newsom calling the decision a great transformation. Listen to this.
The car manufacturers themselves are celebrating and embracing it, including Toyota today, not just Ford and GM. We are going through one of the great transformations in our history, energy transformations.
Steve Patterson joining us now. This is huge, Steve. I got to say, and I bet gas companies aren't necessarily happy about it right about now. How do you do this? How do you implement a plan like this? What is the phase-out schedule?
Well, first of all, I think it's important to start out by saying this. Symbolically, California wants this to be the beginning of the end of the era of the gas-powered car, full stop. 11% of all new passenger car sales across the country come from California. You know, more than a dozen other states are expected to follow their lead. Massachusetts, New York, Washington State all have similar goals, for instance. So, yes, to do that, it kind of has to come in installments, right? So all new cars sold in California by 2035 would be free of greenhouse gas emissions like carbon dioxide. But the plan is to start curbing this early with targets along the way. So the state wants 35% of new passenger vehicles sold at zero emissions by 2025. It wants 68% by 2030. And finally, you guessed it, 100% by 2035. And to enforce this, automakers would be fined by up to $20,000 for every car that falls short of that production goal. But it's a lot. I mean, you're talking about a market that's at about 18% right now, jumping up, as you mentioned, to 100% in just 13 years.
So talk to me about affordability here, right? Because two things. For folks that don't necessarily have the money to buy a new car, they go out and buy a used car. That would be a gas car in that instance, right? And or you're looking at cars that are electric that are a little bit more expensive than their kind of gas models that are on the same plane.
Yeah, a lot more expensive. And I think those two things are very much linked. This is kind of the ultimate cart before the horse argument right now. A lot of people calling this more aspirational than tangible because of a lot of factors. You've got, you know, a supply chain mess, infrastructure that would have to be overhauled. And then, yes, in a lot of cases, you know, this is prohibitively expensive technology. These cars are not cheap. No. You're not going to get an electric car for less than $25,000 in California.
Wow. It
ain't going to happen. And then for a lot of the ones that are out there right now, they're getting marked up because there's such heavy demand. So on average, you know, you're paying closer to about $65,000 or so. So to offset this, there are a number of subsidies, there are rebates for consumers, but there's a huge backlog and those programs need to be expanded. And then on top of that, you're talking about not enough charging stations in the state. We're at something like 80,000 right now. You'd have to be at more than 1 million by 2030, you know, although there is funding for more of that expansion. And then experts say, finally, California's grid, which still largely relies on fossil fuels, is likely nowhere near robust enough to handle millions of electric vehicles all being plugged in at the same time. So, you know, you're talking about more backups like diesel generators or natural gas plants or nuclear energy from the one plant that's still in California to try to keep pace, Yasmin.
13 years. They got 13 years. The clock starts now. So we heard obviously from Newsom as I came to you that automakers, they're on board with this, right? What about environmentalists? What are they saying?
So that's kind of the other side of the coin to what I was just talking about, right? You know, there's certainly nothing that says the law is going to mandate, for instance, taking gas-guzzling cars off the road. You can't stop people from driving in California. Also has no impact on the used car market. And then, you know, most gas-powered cars live on average from 15 to 20 years. So there's nothing to say that we won't still be seeing a lot of these conventional vehicles on the road well into 2050. So there's a lot of concern from environmentalists that say, we haven't pushed this far enough. It isn't coming soon enough. So you're kind of hearing both sides of the coin as officials debate what to do next. Yasmin?
Steve Patterson for us. Thank you, Steve. Want to get you over to the 5 things our team thinks you should know tonight. At number 1, we've been bringing you news about that teacher strike in Ohio. Well, the Columbus Teachers Union and the school board have reached a quote-unquote conceptual agreement that will tentatively end the strike. The terms of the deal are not public yet, but this weekend nearly 4,500 teachers, librarians, and other education professionals will meet to vote on the agreement. The district's 47,000 students began the school year remotely on Wednesday and will continue with virtual learning for the rest of the week. Number 2, another union story. This one, though, is about Starbucks. The National Labor Relations Board says Starbucks is illegally withholding raises from union workers. The board says the coffee chain denied benefits and raises to union employees in order to discourage organizing. Starbucks has denied that claim. Number 3, Pfizer's COVID pill appearing to have little or no benefit for younger adults, according to a large study published on Wednesday. However, it does reduce the risk of hospitalization and death for high-risk seniors. Paxlovid has become the go-to treatment for COVID since it can be taken at home. The Biden administration has spent $10 billion purchasing the drug and making it available at thousands of pharmacies across the country. Number 4. A federal jury awarded Vanessa Bryant, the widow of NBA superstar Kobe Bryant, $16 million in damages over leaked photographs of the site of the helicopter crash that killed her husband and one of their daughters back in 2020. Co-plaintiff Christopher Chester, who lost his wife and 13-year-old daughter in that crash as well, received $15 million. And number 5, here's some news that is going to save you some time, money, and effort, really. Starting early next year, American travelers will be able to renew their passports online. Currently, renewing your passport, it's a frustrating and complicated process that can take anywhere, as they always say, from 8 to 11 weeks and lots of paperwork, but no more, it seems. All right, we want to bring you today's original with in-depth reporting on a topic that we've been keeping an eye on. Walking in for their first day of school today at Oxford High School in Detroit, students were greeted by a new weapons detection system. The community installed it after last year's November 30th mass shooting that left 4 students dead and several others injured. Finding a clear path forward after a school shooting can be confusing for students and for educators. Thankfully, a group of school leaders who've experienced school shootings themselves are lending a helping hand. They're called the Principal Recovery Network. We told you about them earlier this summer, and now they're back with guidance for what schools can do in the aftermath of one of these tragedies. NBC News correspondent Steve Romo has more.
George Roberts was the principal of Perry Hall High School near Baltimore when a student opened fire just hours into the first day of school. Now, 10 years later, Roberts is part of the Principal Recovery Network, a nonpartisan group of current and former principals who've experienced gun violence at their campuses. Back then, he and so many principals since did not have any roadmap to follow during one of the most traumatic days of their lives. That's why the network released their Guide to Recovery.
Really is written by principals for principals, that if something were to happen, it could be something they could push to a principal who needs it right away.
The principals rolled it out this week at the Columbine Memorial in Colorado, 23 years after that high school shooting. Among the guide's topics, what to think about before reopening, how to address student and staff mental health, how to include student input in recovery plans, and how to approach offers of help from outside groups.
This particular document is directly from the viewpoint of being a school leader in the moment of and the days, months, years, and decades thereafter. The usefulness of it is it's quick, it's easy, and it's extremely pragmatic.
Elizabeth Brown became the principal of Forest High School in Ocala, Florida in 2018, just 45 days after a student who'd been expelled shot a classmate with a sawed-off shotgun.
What is not understood by society is the ramifications on the mental health of students, staff, and school community, that this has forever changed their lives.
The network says there are tips that can help, especially right after a shooting, like more faculty meetings, mental health support like trauma counselors and therapy dogs, and hard choices like when to reopen schools, especially if funerals and building repairs are factored in.
It is horrific that we have to have a guide like this. And there will be another school shooting. There will be another active shooter scenario in our country.
A new report from nonprofit Everytown for Gun Safety found the number of gunfire incidents on school grounds quadrupled to 193 last school year, up from an average of 49 per year since 2013. And while the guide might seem alarming heading into this school year, the principals say they're just trying to be practical.
The timing was very deliberate, and our hope was that by releasing this tool at this point in time, some of these pieces of advice would be useful to school leaders that are coming back and revisiting their school safety plans and preparing their school communities to have a safe and solid learning atmosphere this year.
Steve Romo here with me. Now we're watching these kids go back to school. Next week, I believe, kids in Uvalde are going to be going back to school as well. And there's been some kind of major legislation happening over the summer, especially following Uvalde. Take us through quickly kind of a little recap of where we are right now.
Yeah, Uvalde really seemed to be sort of a turning point. It helped spark that landmark gun legislation that was passed by the federal government, the most aggressive legislation in 30 years now on guns. And of course, that helps with the red flag laws, offering funds to states so they can help have those red flag laws on their own. Also expands background checks, so it includes juvenile records for accessing guns, as well as the boyfriend loophole. Very important part of this legislation, the boyfriend loophole, that not only holds married spouses accountable when there are convictions for domestic violence, but also just non-married spouses as well, to help stop them from getting guns.
Yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of movement over the summer, and I also remember Senator Chris Murphy saying, in fact, he hopes this is just the beginning of changes that are to come when it comes to gun legislation. Steve Romo, thanks so much.
Thanks.
Appreciate it. All right, in a Manhattan federal court today, 2 people pled guilty to stealing and selling the diary of President Biden's daughter, Ashley Biden, along with some other stuff of hers, Amy Harris and Robert Kurlander. They admitted it was part of a conspiracy to steal Ashley Biden's property in Florida, where she was living, and taking it to New York. They wanted to sell it to the conservative group Project Veritas just a few weeks before the 2020 election. Prosecutors saying when Kurlander showed Project Veritas pictures of what he and Harris stole, the group paid for them to bring it to the Project Veritas headquarters in New York. According to prosecutors, Project Veritas ended up paying them each $20,000. The group saying it turned the journal over to the authorities and never did anything illegal. Tom Winter is joining us now with more on this. So let me ask you first about Project Veritas. Are they going to at all be held, or can they be held liable with this thing?
Yeah, I think, when you look at this particular case, there's no indication, at least at this point, that Project Veritas has any sort of legal concerns. There doesn't appear to be. To their point, they point out, look, they believe that they're a news organization that has First Amendment protection, and that news organizations receive documents all the time. Even though there's a payment here, it's likely at this point, and we've seen no outward indication. There was an FBI search of the founder of that organization's home, as well as the organization itself. We've seen no indication, at least at this point, that there's going to be any sort of charges levied against either Project Veritas or its founder. So we just don't see that at this point.
Do we know at all why they would pay these 2 individuals and then subsequently turn these diaries over to the authorities after that?
Well, according to Project Veritas, I think they looked at the content of the diaries and felt that they couldn't properly authenticate some of the things that happened. There could be some things in there that they would need to check out prior to publication, that was a situation where they may not have been able to get confirmation of it, and ultimately they turned, according to the organization, they decided to turn over the documents to the FBI and also not publish the contents of them.
So I guess the question now is, where does this go from here? Because it seems like this agreement was based on these 2 individuals agreeing to cooperate with the government. So what does that mean? And
Kurlander specifically. So just Kurlander has a cooperation agreement with the government. He's going to be subject to a 5K letter, meaning that if he does complete that cooperation, federal prosecutors will ask for a substantial reduction in any sort of sentence that he receives. I think for the 2 of them, they have to restate their taxes. First off, they have to declare the income that they received as a result of these payments. They agreed to turn over $20,000. And both are going to be convicted federal felons at this standpoint. I think there's also probably a deterrence factor here, in that if you start to steal political rivals or somebody's information and then try to sell it to make money off of it, that it might be advantageous to a particular campaign or to a particular group. That could get you in serious trouble with the feds. I think it's important to note federal prosecutors say in their criminal information that was filed today that this information was originally, or this diary rather, and some other contents were originally brought to the Trump campaign, and that they turned it down, and they suggested that the documents be turned over to the FBI. At some point later, Project Veritas is in communication with them. We don't know how that communication kind of came about and who talked to who and why. So that might be something that an ongoing investigation looks into. I think that's still a bit of an open question at this point.
Tom Winter, thank you.
Sure thing.
Talk tennis, everybody, because it's that time of year. U.S. Open around the corner. The tennis world buzzing with news that Novak Djokovic will miss the U.S. Open next week because he didn't get vaccinated. The 21-time major champion, who is from Serbia and is the 6th ranked player in the world, pulled out of the tournament today knowing he would not be allowed to enter the country. U.S. rules saying any non-U.S. citizen must be fully vaccinated against the virus in order to receive a visa. Djokovic has remained unvaccinated against COVID throughout this pandemic and says he does not plan to get the shot. He tweeted, "Sadly, I will not be able to travel to New York this time for the U.S. Open." He says he'll wait for an opportunity to compete again. This is not, by the way, I'm sure as many of you know, the first time Djokovic's vax status has caused drama. He was deported from Australia back in January because he was unvaccinated. That caused him to miss the Australian Open as well. I want to bring in Andrew Krasny from the Tennis Channel. I'm going to suspect, Andrew, that this was not necessarily a surprise, considering all of the controversy that surrounded Djokovic back in January, and now that he's pulling out of the U.S. Open.
Yasmin, no surprise, but anybody who loves Novak, including myself, was hoping that, A, the regulations would have been lifted, or he would be vaccinated. Neither of those have come to fruition, so today's news was not a shocker, but it is a bummer.
So can we talk a little bit more about that? I'm a little bit of a tennis geek myself. I played college tennis. I'll just put it out there. But Djokovic is a contender. I mean, he's a player. He's a beast, right? 6th rank in the world. When you have someone like that drop out of the U.S. Open, what does that mean for the tournament overall?
Well, first of all, he should be ranked number 1 in the world. He's ranked number 6 because he's been unable to defend points since he hasn't been able to play tournaments. So, listen, there's a lot of guys who, first of all, no one's happy that Novak's not there because of the circumstances, but some people are happy to not have to face him. So there's a difference, right? Daniil Medvedev, who's the defending champion, has a great chance to retain his title. Rafael Nadal, who's going for that big number 23. I mean, there's a lot of people who love Novak, but they're not that bummed out that they don't have to play him, but they're bummed out that he's not there.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I mean, why would you want to have to face off against Novak Djokovic? It's just someone else that's out of the tournament now, so you can get a little bit more ahead. What are officials saying there, tournament officials saying?
Okay, so I'm not speaking on their behalf, but I will tell you what they are saying is that, look, it's the U.S. Open, and they have to go by U.S. rules and regulation. And as you said at the top of your story, that it is the federal government's vaccination policy that no one from outside of the country who's not an American citizen cannot come into our country unless they're vaccinated. So we're not surprised. I think we're hoping by, say, come March, when the BNP Paribas Open and the Miami Open are, that maybe rules will change.
Yeah.
But as of now, it is what it is. Novak is no stranger to controversy.
Yeah.
We're not happy about it. But there is good news.
Yes.
There's good news that at the end of the tunnel, if you'll see Novak Djokovic play tennis, he's going to be playing Laver Cup in just a couple of weeks. I'm going to be there. He's going to be in London playing with Roger and Rafa and Andy Murray and Casper Ruud. So Novak Djokovic will be on a tennis court in just a couple of weeks.
Well, he better spend his time training then, I guess, since he's not going to be playing in the U.S. Open.
He is training. He's training and hoping for that small window of opportunity where he'll be able to come in and play. So a lot of people are bummed out. We love Novak a lot, but rules are rules, and no one's above the law.
Yeah. Andrew Krasny, thanks.
Thanks.
All right, a political action committee with an unlikely source has had big consequences for some schools in Texas. Coming up in tonight's Backstory, how a conservative Christian cell phone company has had an impact on what students are taught in public schools. We'll be right back. All right, it's time to get the backstory, a behind-the-scenes look at how a story comes together and how it fits into the bigger picture. Tonight, we're looking at how a far-right Christian cell service company went on a mission to take control of Texas school boards and ended up winning in some places. Texas-based Patriot Mobile is answering a call from former Trump advisor Steve Bannon to, quote, save the nation by getting conservatives on the seats of local school boards. Earlier on this year, the company made its own political action committee, Patriot Mobile Action, and gave it more than $600,000 to spend on nonpartisan school board races in the suburbs of Fort Worth. By the spring, the PAC had blanketed the communities of Southlake, Keller, Grapevine, and Mansfield. Their candidates won every race, and now they're delivering results. Just this week, The Grapevine-Colleyville School District's board voted in favor of policies to restrict how teachers discuss race and gender. We reached out to Patriot Mobile officials for comment, but they did not respond. Mike Hixenbaugh has been reporting on this and joins us now. Mike, talk to us because, you know, as we're talking about the backstory here, how this whole thing comes together, one executive at Patriot Mobile actually said that she wouldn't talk to you at CPAC because she didn't trust NBC News. As journalists, right, we have to tell the whole story, every side of the story, and with that, we need responses from everybody. How do you deal with a situation like that?
Well, I've gotten used to dealing with that situation. That's right. When I drove up to CPAC in Dallas earlier this month for the purpose of trying to speak with Patriot Mobile executives, I knew they would be there. They're always at that conservative conference. And when I approached, the VP of Media Affairs for the company and told her, look, I want to tell the story of what your company and your political action committee have done. She, like you said, she told me that, no, I don't trust your coverage. I don't like the stories you've written about this subject broadly. But the good news, I guess, for me as a journalist is a lot of these folks, they do a lot of talking in other spaces. And so we were able to fully represent their perspective in my article by quoting things they told Steve Bannon on his show or on AM conservative talk radio. And so, we have to work around those obstacles to tell the whole story. Yeah,
that's how you flesh out the story. Talking about specifically the situation at Grapevine-Colleyville School District, one ACLU attorney telling you, in fact, that this is the most extreme board policy related to classroom censorship. Were you surprised at the scale this company's impact had on local boards?
No, because I've been following these culture wars over race and gender and sexuality in schools over the past year and a half. And when I saw the money that Patriot Mobile was putting into these four school board races, and I saw, they brought in national level GOP political consultants to craft messaging, to create flyers that they blanketed these across these communities. I expected them to win all these races because they weren't. There was no one on the other side to challenge what they were doing. And then we saw in Grapevine-Colleyville this week the results of what happens when these groups are able to take control of the school board.
And you talk about that with the school board meeting, and it seemed as if, as you wrote, it turned into essentially a circus, which is not the first time we've seen something like this happen.
Absolutely not. School boards have been a circus for a year and a half or 2 years now across the country. But this meeting was a little bit different in that some of these far-right groups that have been working on this, they declared this a celebration. This was a victory party. They came and tailgated in the parking lot. Wow. And it was a really, intense scene full of a lot of emotion.
Wow. And I tell you, it's not just happening in Texas. By the way, it's happening in the South. It's happening here in the Northeast. It's happening really across the country in small towns that we don't even necessarily know about as of yet, but only will learn in the future. Mike Hixenbaugh, as always, thank you for your good reporting on this. That wraps the hour for me, everybody. We're going to have more for you here tomorrow, same time, same place. Coverage picks up right now.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.